Shalini, I have a list because it's very impressive, now you will understand. Professor Shalini Randeria is Director of the Institute for Human Sciences in Vienna and Research Director and Professor of Social Anthropology and Sociology at the Graduate Institute of International and Development Studies in Geneva. Furthermore, she is Visiting Professor in the Social Science Research Center at Berlin. She has been a member of the Senate of the German Research Council, President of the European Association of Social Anthropologists, and Fellow of the Institute of Advanced Studies, Berlin. Her fields of research are anthropology of law, transnationalization of law, legal pluralism, anthropology of globalization and development, anthropology of state and public policy, civil society, social movements, and NGOs. And her regional focus is on South Asia. I chose two recent publications just to give you an overview of her latest writings. One of them, she co-edited the book with Thomas Randeria, Anthropology Now and Next, Diversity, Connections, Confrontations, Productivity. The other one is Critical Mobilities. Again, co-edited with Ola Soderstrom, Didier Eroded, Gianni D'Amato, and Francesco? I don't understand my Panese, it is. Thank you. We will be listening now to the lecture entitled Fragmented Sovereignties in an Era of Globalization, Challenges for Cunning States and Citizens. Professor Shalini.
Thank you very much. Thank you very, very much for the invitation to speak to you today. It's a great honor and a pleasure to be here. It's my very first time in America, and I'm very happy to be able to make the acquaintance of the Center for Advanced Studies here, because I've known all three directors from their visits to Vienna, so it's the first time that I'm able to visit the institution in its home. And I'm very grateful to all three of you for the invitation and for this wonderful visit. The question to be addressed today is, in my view, a double one. I wanted to talk to you a little bit about my work on sovereignty. If I'm going too fast, just raise your hand. I'm going to sort of talk you through some of my own work. So the questions I want to deal with are questions of sovereignty on the one hand and of legal pluralism on the other hand, trying to make an argument for how we need to understand the state as an actor in a new landscape of sovereignties and landscape of fractured sovereignties and a new landscape of legal pluralism. And because of the changing landscape of both law and the nature of statehood, the kinds of options that we as citizens have, options to act in this formation, have changed dramatically. Both our options have been open in some ways, but they have been narrowed and closed on others. The paradoxical story of the kinds of challenges faced by citizens with regard to states, and I'm going to argue for something called the Cunning state, that faced by Cunning states, citizens are really caught in a dilemma, and the question is how to render Cunning states accountable. So this is sort of his background. This is the theoretical argument, and I'll come to that in a moment. The empirical work that I base myself on are 4 empirical projects which I have worked on in the last years. I'm an anthropologist, like I think most of you in the room. So my theorizing comes very much from the kind of empirical material which I have. The one empirical project which I've been working on for many years is in the city of Bombay, where in a World Bank funded infrastructure development project, 100,000 people have been displaced from their homes because of the way in which the railway tracks have been built new and the roads have been widened. So it's infrastructure development, but the price of that infrastructure development is the displacement of a lot of very poor population in the city. It's a complicated story of how this kind of new neoliberal patterns of urban development, because here the actors are the World Bank, the city of Bombay through a parastate in which it has set up, NGOs who are implementing the project, and especially the displacement component for the World Bank, and citizens' organizations who are fighting against both the NGOs and the state, and using the World Bank to fight against the state and the NGOs. So it's a very complicated constellation on the ground, which I have been looking at for over 5 or 6 years. This is research done with a student of mine, Kira Kroder. My other research project is on a special economic zone on the western coast of India. It is by one of India's very rapidly advancing to the top list of Indian millionaires, industrialists, Mr. Adani, who has been given a large chunk of land which has privatized the entire coast, very close to the Pakistan border, and he has set up a special economic zone there. I have been looking there at the protest movements of the local population against the destruction of their livelihoods. So these are agricultural workers, farmers, these are fishermen, fishing communities, and these are pastoralists. These are people who have goats and sheep and camels, which they breed. So they are nomadic pastoralists, semi-nomadic pastoralists. So I've been looking at their struggle against this. And here again, the World Bank is interestingly involved because the World Bank has given credits to set up energy power plants in the area, and the World Bank is financing, therefore, not the special economic zone itself, but the companies which are set up on the special economic zone. And I've been looking at the way in which political mobilization and legal protest, law courts and political mobilization work in tandem in mobilizing people against the destruction of their livelihoods. And here too, people have been using the ombudsman of the World Bank in order to put pressure on the government of India to redress their grievances. So again, it's a very interesting constellation of the use of transnational law in order to render the state accountable. The third project that I have been involved in has been a project on nature conservation. So this is the only home of the Asiatic lion in India, which is again a project which involves the World Bank, which is paying for conserving the natural habitat of the lions. But the lions are in an area which has been turned into a national park and a protected area, which means that nobody can live in that area. So the turning of territory into a national park means you are displacing the population in the area. And these are semi-nomadic buffalo breeders. So these are pastoralists who have large buffalo herds. So this is again a project in which dispossession and displacement is a major factor, like in all my projects. So if you like, if I were to tell this story from another point of view, I would tell you a story of large-scale displacement and dispossession in India due to new neoliberal designs of nature conservation, special economic zones, and urban development. So this story can be told as a story of dispossession, if that is the way you want to tell the story. The fourth project I'm involved in is a project which I'm doing at the moment, which is totally different, but it fractures sovereignty in a very different way. And that is, this is the project I'm engaged in with a lawyer colleague of mine in Geneva, Zachary Douglas, who is one of the world's leading experts on investment arbitration. Now, investment arbitration seems very remote and abstract, but I think some of you may have been following the debates around TTIP. So TTIP, this transatlantic European-American treaty, which has been opposed a lot in Austria, in Germany, in Britain, and it's hanging in the air at the moment. One of the major bones of contention in TTIP is the arbitration mechanism. And the arbitration mechanism, just to give you in 2 minutes what the story is about, in German it would be Schiedsgerichtsbarkeit. I don't know if German helps anyway, but arbitration mechanism here is a highly contentious mechanism. The arbitration mechanism, see, normally if you have two private companies which have a conflict, so Vodafone wants to sue Sony, you will have commercial arbitration. You have two commercial companies which are suing each other using arbitration. This is private international law, and it's not a problem as citizens. In investment arbitration mechanisms, which is what we are looking at in a comparative project of Czech Republic, India, Argentina, and Mexico, in investment arbitration mechanisms, private companies, private corporations are bringing suits, claims against states. So a company is treated in law as if it were a state, and it can sue a state. So if it is suing a state, what it is doing is going in for arbitration, but this arbitration is between the state and a private corporation, according to the investment arbitration treaties. And the problems here are not only of the unequal nature of the resources involved, such as arbitration, but the fact that when a state loses a claim like this, and many states are losing these claims against companies, it is paying out fines in millions and millions and hundreds of millions of dollars to companies. So this is our tax money, and yet the arbitration is held without any public scrutiny. So you and I cannot attend an arbitration tribunal. And not only can we not attend an arbitration tribunal, we are not even, in most cases, arbitration awards are not made public. So we don't even know the grounds on which our governments have lost those cases. But they are paying out these millions, and it's very interesting how they are paying out the millions, etc., but this is a totally separate story. So there is a lot of problem about the transparency or the intransparency of arbitration, and there is also a problem in the case of arbitration about the effect that arbitration treaties have on public decision making. So what our project is looking at is not the question which law and economics is asking, which is if a state signs an arbitration treaty, does foreign direct investment go up or not? But we are asking the question, what are the effects on public decision-making by government officials? How are they constrained in their options for political choices and decisions by the arbitration treaties in investment arbitration which the governments have signed? And so this is a very interesting and critical project where we are doing a lot of interviews with the state government officials in these 4 countries. We are talking to journalists, we are looking at media reports, we are talking to the lawyers of the companies, we are talking to the lawyers. So these are the 4 kinds of empirical projects from which some of my theoretical insights into this develop. And what I basically want to share with you on the basis of these projects are theoretical ideas, conceptualizations in 3 areas. One, thinking about practices of sovereignty, one on legal pluralism, and the third on cunning states. And then we just discuss whatever you would like to discuss, because for me it would be much more interesting to pick up the questions which interest you rather than tell you about things which probably don't interest you. So then just feel free to ask whatever is of interest to you. So the first argument I want to make about sovereignty is that unlike in political science, where you basically assume the sovereignty of states, I would make the argument that sovereignty does not accrue naturally to a state. Sovereignty is a set of practices that are historically contingent, and they are a mixture of both international and intranational processes, including self-determination and ideas about natural rights. So we need to historicize the idea of sovereignty, considering both the changing meanings of sovereignty and the entities which are practicing sovereignty. So I will not give you any overarching definition of sovereignty, because such a definition is ahistorical and without sensitivity to context. So in my view, my first argument is that we need to examine strategic sovereignties that have informed histories and have shaped territories in the modern world. So the uncertain and the contested nature of sovereignty is something which is important. And secondly, the argument that you can only look at practices of sovereignty, because sovereignty, for me as an anthropologist, is a making of claims in the name of sovereignty. It's not something which exists pre-given out there. So as most of you know, discussions of sovereignty have gone into two directions in the social sciences in the last 2 decades. One has been a focus on individuated experiences. This draws on the work of Carl Schmitt, but often in my view misreadings of Schmitt. It looks at sovereignty as an authoritative decision in an exceptional situation. A lot of the work then takes off from there and talks about sovereignty as performance, sovereign bodies, and metaphorical shifts about claims that have to be, that are used to repoliticize individuals or reconceive autonomy. The second use of sovereignty has been where people have assumed that sovereignty is an inherited feature, an inherent feature of a functioning state. So the states which are not sovereign are failing states or failed states. And I think this is also the political science conceptualization of sovereignty doesn't take us very far for 2 reasons. One, because I think the dichotomy of successful or failed states is a dichotomy which doesn't capture the variety of practices of statehood. So that I think what we are looking at today are, in large parts of the world, spaces of what we would call spaces of limited statehood. How that statehood is being limited by external actors, international actors, or subnational actors is something which we as anthropologists can do an ethnographic study of. And so you can have a state practicing, or its sovereignty being fractured, practicing limited sovereignty, both in the face of IMF or World Bank credit conditionalities, but you can also have subnational actors limiting sovereignty. So let me give you an example from India. We have almost 1/5 to 1/6 of the Union territory of India under the control of Maoist movements. So these are armed insurgency movements in India who control large parts of the Indian territory. These are the highly mineral-rich central Indian territory, where there is bauxite, which is used for making aluminum, where there is the coal industry, where there are other minerals, etc. So multinational and domestic Indian corporations are very interested in these areas. And the populations are what the government of India calls Adivasis. So these are scheduled tribes, as they are called in the government of India vocabulary. These are indigenous populations who are sitting on mineral-rich areas. These are areas which are formally controlled by the Maoist movement, which not only is collecting taxes from the corporations in the area, you can call these bribes, you can call them taxes, but it is also adjudicating and dispensing justice. Similarly, we have colleagues who are doing field work in Afghanistan or who are doing field work in Syria, who are showing that the ISIS and the Taliban on the ground, so in Aleppo or in northern Afghanistan, it is non-state actors like the Taliban or the ISIS who are actually doing conflict resolution on a daily basis on the ground. They are dispensing justice, they are setting up local administrations. So, but in Kabul, this is not the case. In Delhi, this is not the case. So it's not a question of having a failed state or a non-failed state. It's a question of which parts of the state's territory are under the state's control for what particular purposes, and what parts of the state's population is fully controlled by the state for what purposes. And therefore, we have been making the argument, I've been working with a lot of political scientists in Berlin at the Free University, we have been making the argument, it's much more interesting to think in terms of spaces of limited statehood and then look at how these spaces are limited, in what way, and how states are constrained in exercising different functions of statehood rather than to think in terms of failed or failing states. And this gives you a much more nuanced view of this. The argument of cunning states, which I make, is an argument also against political science, where there's, as many of you know, they have the dichotomy of weak states and strong states. And my argument against the political science dichotomy of strong and weak states has always been that it's not a question of state capacity. Yeah? But weak and strong states is an argument in terms of what are the capacities of the state. My argument on cunning states has always been that this is very much a question of claims by the state about its weakness and about its strength. So I think, interestingly, cunning states are very good at getting out of their responsibility to their citizens by claiming to be strategically weak in policy areas in which it's much easier for them to shift the responsibility to supranational actors. So it's so much easier to say, our hands are tied, we couldn't do anything else, it's the EU which forced us to do something. It's so much easier to say for the government of India that we would have done a completely different economic policy, but the IMF forced us into doing this. So by shifting responsibility onto other external actors, of course, you are able to absolve yourself of the accountability to your citizens. So the cunning of the state is, in a sense, a good way of getting out of being accountable. So that it's a strategic claim to state weakness where actually there is a lack of political will. So it's not a matter of capacity, but it's lack of absence of political will masquerading as weakness. And this is something that many states have been playing on. I think at the moment we are seeing state cunning in very interesting ways, both in terms of strength and weakness. The fact that so many European states are claiming to be too weak to be able to either host the refugees or able to take care of them, that they're letting the NGOs provide services so that the state doesn't have to provide them. I think in many ways this is a very strategic display of weakness in order not to have to take on the responsibility. It's just, for me, I think it is inconceivable that some countries which are claiming not to have the resources or capabilities cannot take 7,000 refugees or 5,000 refugees. So I think we need to examine the state's claims about its weakness as a strategic move of cunning rather than take it at its face value that it is. So these are the same states which are too weak to take refugees but are claiming to be strong enough to control their borders. So So it's always a very strategic claim in which areas states are claiming to be weak and which areas they are claiming to be strong, right? So I'll give you an example from my own fieldwork in India, which sort of alerted me to one aspect of this, and then I'll give you another example and show you why I came to this idea. I was working on population policy in India. I was looking at how USAID is trying to reduce fertility rates in India's most populous state, UP, Uttar Pradesh. And what I found was the government of India has the machinery to collect data from every village in India about every woman on how many children that woman has, what contraceptive method she has been using, and of fixing quotas for the use of different kinds of contraceptives based on demographic projections of how much fertility should be decreased. So it has an entire machinery in place to be able to influence fertility, not that it can do it successfully, but the machinery is there to collect the data. But it's the same state which claims that it is unable to issue birth certificates to all its citizens because it just doesn't have the machinery to do it. So you are able to collect all the data on fertility, but you cannot register births. And it's very interesting because it has no interest in registering births. But of course it has an interest in controlling fertility. So this was sort of my first indication that you really have to take state claims to what it can do and what it cannot do, not as a matter of the absence of presence of state capacity, but looking very carefully at what are state practices in certain areas and why is it that the state cannot do certain things. Patents, so I was looking at intellectual property rights, I was looking at which patents the government of India is contesting on behalf of its citizens and where, and which patents it's not contesting. I started looking, so when in around 1999, 2000, when I was doing fieldwork in the IMF and the World Bank, what I found was that the government of India had just told me, officials whom I had interviewed, our hands are tied, it's the IMF which sets credit conditionalities, we have to do what they tell us. I go to Washington DC and I'm talking to the IMF lawyers and the economists and they are telling me, after all we're dealing with sovereign states, we can't really tell them what to do. So I said, so what do you do with India, with Russia? They said, oh, we give them these loans and we put the conditionalities and then they contravene the conditionalities. And then I said, then what do you do? And we give them the next loan. And then we give them the next tranche of the loan. So I thought this is a really amazing story in 2000 that the government of India claims that it's too weak against the IMF, but the IMF claims it's too weak against the government of India. And I thought to myself, what a world this is in 2000. Where is all the power gone? Nobody claims to have power. In the international organizations where you would think all the power resides are claiming weakness. The governments where you think power should reside are claiming to be weak. And this puts, of course, citizens in a very, very difficult situation because where are you going to address protest to? You go and protest in Delhi and they will tell you, go to Washington DC because the IMF and the World Bank have decided what the economic and fiscal and monetary policies should be. And you go to the DC and protest, which is what a lot of citizens did in transnational social movements, and the World Bank and the IMF say, sorry, we are dealing with sovereign states, go home and protest against your own elected government. So in this system of 4 sets of unaccountable actors, because states have made themselves unaccountable, international organizations are not accountable to us as citizens, they are only accountable to their members who are sovereign states. So the WTO, the IMF, the World Bank, they are unaccountable to us. Multinational corporations are unaccountable to us as citizens, they are only accountable to their shareholders. And interestingly, think about whom, now all of us love the civil society, but to whom is civil society accountable? Whom are NGOs accountable to, who are taking foreign funding? You have 4 sets of unaccountable actors who are all intermeshed with one another in local, national, and transnational are the political spaces for action in this, and one of the spaces I started investigating were lawsuits, the law. And where are the legal spaces, and what are the new legal spaces in which citizens can protest, and why is so much protest today in terms of the law? And this was the whole area of work that I've been doing in the last 10 years about the judicialization of politics. So this is about why it's making a larger argument of why there is a judicialization of politics, and why the boundary between law and politics is completely blurred. The boundary between law and policy is blurred. The boundary between hard law and soft law is blurred. And the blurring of these boundaries opens new spaces, both within the state but also transnationally. So at the moment, for example, from the special economic zone where I have been doing fieldwork, the farming community has filed a lawsuit against the World Bank in an American court in DC. And the World Bank has just claimed 2 weeks ago in this lawsuit that the World Bank is immune from any legal prosecution. So we are looking now to see what's going to happen. We have a slightly different argument here because we've not filed, or the claimants whom I'm helping have not filed a suit on against the bank, but against the IDA, which is the private lending mechanism in the World Bank. And what our argument is that the IDA cannot claim legal immunity because the IDA is also registered in the US as a bank. So therefore, it is an international institution as part of the World Bank, but being registered as a bank is also a bank, and therefore legally liable. Whether any US court is going to accept this argument, we will see. But it's a test case to be able to bring an international institution to some kind of accountability. There have been a lot of cases which I've been following, which are cases of the inspection panel of the World Bank, which in itself was set up as a result of a 20-year-old people's movement in India against the Narmada Dam. So one of the successes of the movement was getting this mechanism set up at the bank, the inspection panel. I've been following how it's been used by various citizens' claims, etc. And let me end with the third point in the historical concept is important to me, that is what has happened to the legal landscape here. So that what we are getting at the moment is a very fragmented legal landscape. So it's fractured sovereignties, fractured both by supranational institutions, but also, as I argue, by subnational actors, with supranational connections or not. Like the Indian Maoist movement has few supranational connections, but the Taliban have excellent international connections. But what you're getting also are transnationalization of law in very many interesting ways. Now, for lawyers, they are sitting up and saying this is a completely new phenomenon because law and the state were coterminous. The state was exercising control over a certain territory and a certain population, and therefore the law of the state was only bounded to that territory and population. And of course, if you take a post-colonial view of this, and you take 200 years of history, or in Latin America even longer than that, you will realize that the law was transnationalized in the global south since several centuries, because you had many layers of transnational law. You had religious law, which was transnational. The Muslim Ummah was never national. In fact, the law was a transnational formation. So you had that. You had church law, which was transnational, which was never national law. You had law, which was imperial law, which was also not national. It was always transnational. So you had many kinds of transnational formations and transnationalization of law much before international law came into force and became an issue. And you also had very many kinds of local law, what was called customary law in Africa or what is called other in Indonesia. But these are not local laws. These are laws which are localized under colonialism. So it's a very specific convention or tradition as custom and customary law. So this puts a very different spin on what kind of law that is. And in this whole constellation of legal pluralism gets added a nation-state law in decolonized countries after independence, but in Europe then with the making of the nation-state. And so you have a constellation of very many different kinds of norms with different sources. You have very many new arena of the legal arena, and you have very many new legal actors. And therefore you have a pluralism of actors, of arena, and of norms and sources of norms, some of it new and some of it not so new. It only looks new to the lawyers because they are so wedded to the nation state as the only source of law and having legal law. But if you have a post-colonial view of this, you will realize that this is not that new. So I've been basically making the argument, and with that I would like to stop, I've been making the argument that a lot of these developments which look so new, if you look at them from a post-colonial point of view, they have a different history. And there's a lot of continuity, there's rupture as well. It's not only continuity, but they have a different history than if you are just looking through the lens of the last 20 years or 40 years or 50 years of nation-state formation. And therefore, the imperial background to many of the kinds of issues that we are seeing today in the post-imperial world may be a much better framework to understand some of the specificities also of the developments today. So we should go back, even as anthropologists, much further in our understanding, historicizing a lot of these phenomena. And therefore, a lot of the kinds of constellations that we are seeing today, transnational pluralism or fractured sovereignties, where the global south is showing the modern West today some of the features of the future that it can be facing. So I would make the argument since 2000, since I've been working on this, that actually you could turn Karl Marx on the head. He thought that the West is showing a mirror of its future to the non-Western world, and it could very well be that the non-Western world is showing the West its own future in the way sovereignty can get fractured, in the way citizenship rights can get extremely problematic, in the way that states can get unaccountable, and in the way in which the chickens of the empire can come home to roost.
Wonderful. If I may sit less formal. That was wonderfully interesting, thought-provoking, and I hope that all of us will now take home with us some ideas to think about. I won't talk too much, I just wanted to say one thing. This idea of the Cunning state is fascinating. I think all of us students have got a lot to think about here, where we can see this, if I may use the word performance, maybe tell me if it's the wrong, but this performance of weakness.
It is a performance of weakness.
To avoid responsibility is a very interesting idea which we should all think about, perhaps in our everyday lives as well. But it's a very interesting way, especially now with what's going on with our borders here. We've got lots of people professing weakness, absolving responsibility to another institution. European Union are going to decide they're absolving back. It's a sort of ping-pong going on of responsibility. This is what I like very much about your question, where has all the power gone? Wonderful, yes, because it seems like the world, I mean, just from a global, is in total chaos, and there's no one organising it. Where we're used to having somebody to say what's going on, there seems to be that's not here. And then when we think of this manoeuvre, this performance of weakness, is in fact where the power is in this actual movement. So that's one area we can think about deeply. And this, what you said at the end, is perhaps the most, well, not the most thought-provoking, but another extremely thought-provoking area. This idea that how we can frame all of what's going on conceptually. It's very problematic at the moment. It seems like lots of our tools that we have, analytical tools, but as you say, they're using tools which are in the more recent of our history. We aren't going back. We need to look back, perhaps, as you say, further, where we can look at analytical tools and borrow things from other time, if you like, zones. We often frame, I was just thinking, in anthropology, kinship. We now have new kinship. We have all these new things, everything's new, somebody stuck new in front of it. And that becomes very confusing because it creates a break from the past. It disrupts the continuity. So we should think very much about that. I'm not going to try to divert your words too much for my purposes, but when I talk about long-gone anthropologists, this is useful to think about them. It's not that I'm just doing that to torment you with long-gone anthropologists, but those ideas, they were forming ideas perhaps in a framework which was in that time zone. So they're very relevant to us. Again, as you say, there's disruptions and changes, but we can also borrow those ideas, or perhaps use those ideas as a starting point for our analysis now. I think it's, for all of us, very important that we try to get an analytical handle on what's going on. And I would like to thank you very much on behalf of everyone here, but for myself, because I think you have given a handle with which we can analytically go forwards to try and organise our thoughts. So that's it from me. And now some questions from you, which I hope, I don't know who would like to start. Does anyone have a question? Oh, Jen.
Thank you so much for this really stimulating lecture. I'm really sympathetic to the idea of counting states as one a constellation of actors making claims for sovereignty or lack thereof, and particularly I think to perhaps reiterate some of the comments, this notion that fragmented sovereignties might be a good way of provincializing Europe yet again, to invoke the English Rodriguez's wonderful phrase. I have two questions. The first has two parts, and it's a broadly conceptual question. I guess I wonder how the concept of fragmented sovereignties relates to several other concepts that are commonly invoked as analyses of the contemporary political development, in particular that of Foucauldian governmentality, and perhaps more specifically neoliberal governmentality, the notion of the self-regulating entrepreneurial citizen who is no longer perhaps involved in the kind of classic modern state society formations that we think of, and therefore exposed to new forms of power and governance. So Foucault himself, of course, said that in the context of governmentality, it's not as though the problem of sovereignty disappears, rather it's made all the more acute. So it's wrong to think of these as somehow phases that we move from one to the other. But I wondered where governmentality would sit as a concept vis-a-vis fragmented sovereignties. Secondly, I was thinking a lot about Partha Chatterjee's arguments in Politics of the Governed through what you were saying, and his invocation of political society as a concept that somehow will get around these four actors that you mentioned that are all in different ways non-accountable: states, international institutions, transnational corporations, and civil society organizations. He's particularly critical of civil society as a concept that can't be removed from its problematic bourgeois European history. So I wondered if you were interacting with his arguments at all. The second question has to do with legal pluralism, and when the phrase legal pluralism comes up, as you hinted, the first thing that comes to mind is colonial era law, and in particular personal status law, and the division between Sharia and adat in certain contexts. And of course that was a way of, in some ways, suspending sovereign authority on the part of the colonial state in the interest of not governing. So I'm just wondering you already said some of this, but if you could bring out those genealogies just a bit more to this current moment where legal pluralism is actually focusing more on these abstract actors that we don't think of as matters of personal status at all.
Excellent questions, complicated ones. I give you a brief answer to some of these, and then we can maybe afterwards have a longer talk about this in case people have other kinds of issues they'd like to raise. So, as far as, let me start with the second one first, Politics of the Governed, Partha Chatterjee's book. I think it's a very astute analysis of some kind of phenomena that he's looking at, and I think the use of Gramsci to think with especially this distinction between civil and political society is very, very useful. Two things are missing in that book, I think. One, he is thinking of the civil, and this is true of the whole genealogy of the idea of civil society, because civil society, don't forget, is a concept which is used as in thinking of a formation in which it's what state is not and market is not, right? But it is it's a concept which we have from an era in which even the market was thought only in state terms. So it's very much a concept, a child of the 19th century, where a certain public sphere is being formed in a certain way in which you are still thinking of it, or 18th century, but still very much in a nation-state context. So what Partha Chatterjee doesn't do in the book is think about international organizations or transnational corporations at all. So they're not actors. So the kind of story he's telling and the kind of empirical examples he's using are all examples of political mobilization by the poor against the state. So that I think it has a much more limited scope, which doesn't mean that one could not somehow extend that scope, but in order to do it, one would really have to think about Gramsci's ideas and take them out of that particular context. In which they get formed and in which he also applies them. And that brings me to the question that you were raising, or I think, which is, what is the, so I think we really have a problem about the conceptual apparatus with which we want to think about our times. But one problem we have there is that all the social sciences are children of the 19th century and 20th century. So the social sciences come with a conceptual apparatus which is the apparatus of the nation state. So political science, sociology, economics, all of these disciplines have developed at a time when they are tied into the development of the nation state. And therefore society is territorial nation-state society. A polity is a territorial nation-state polity. An economy is a political economy of the nation. Anthropology didn't have this problem, right? Because anthropology is a child of the nation-state, but of its colonializing part. So anthropology is thinking of tribes and villages, but not of nation-states. Therefore, it has, its problem is a different one. It doesn't have a conceptual apparatus, really. So it's through the anthropology of the state today that we are beginning to think about the nation-state as a unit which you can do any work on as a tribe. So one of the things I've been trying to do is an anthropology of state, which is where Cunning state comes in to think about looking at state practices. So, what were the two other alternatives available as a unit of analysis? Max Weber, civilizations. Civilizations defined by religion. So you have another unit of analysis, which is an interesting unit of analysis. Eisenstadt also works with comparative civilizational analysis. So you have two very major thinkers in the sociological Western tradition who are, thinking of civilizations as units, but defined by religion, and not only by just religion, but defined by what the Germans call Hochreligion, Hochkultur, high culture and high religion. So Africa has no civilization, and Latin America also doesn't have any civilization, right? So anthropology is relegated to looking at those parts of the world which have no high civilization and high. So you're getting a very curious disciplinary division of labor with conceptual apparatuses which are different because of this, because kinship is something you can study at the level of the tribe, supposedly, and the village, or the island, for Malinowski, the Trobrians, but you can't study the nation state, right? So I think we really need to think about what of our conceptual apparatus is a child of this particular era, and which of our conceptual tools and also methodological tools, are they adequate to study phenomena at higher scales. So the kinds of methodological problems I'm struggling with are how do you take the methods of ethnography which we have developed to look at practices at a very local level, to study practices at many scales, and how can you link those scales in the kinds of stories that you are willing to or you would like to tell. So this is sort of the other part of the puzzle for me. And of course, there is one other conception which, interestingly, if you think about it, is the empire. The empire would be a unit of analysis to think about many of the political formations of our time, and not empire in the Negri sense, a real empire, as historical formations as we have known them. Now, the interesting thing here is that if you think of all the social theory you know from the 19th and 20th century, you have no theorizations of empire. Marx is thinking a little bit about imperialism, but he thinks imperialism is not such a bad thing, because he thinks that colonialism and imperialism will get rid of feudalism. So Marx is ambivalent about imperialism and colonialism. Weber, no thought on imperialism. Durkheim, no thought. Zimmel, never worried about imperialism. Even Foucault has very little sense of imperialism. So the post-structuralists, although Francis had an empire, which you would have think, and so many of them came from they were born in Algeria, like Baudu. Yeah? So Baudu has a sense of colonialism, but not when he theorizes. A theory of praxis has no sense of colonialism. So interestingly, the one formation, in my view, which could help us think differently about some of these transnational formations would be the empire, and that is one formation on which we have very little sociological theory. And it's interesting also to speculate as to why there is this total absence of the empire in all our sociology. Yeah? But this is a separate story, I won't go into that, but I think it really, and political science as well, it's also not thinking about that. So with that I come to the question of neoliberal governmentality, because it's sort of an oblique way of getting to Foucault. And the question is, I think the question of fragmented sovereignties and neoliberal governmentality is something one could tie together at certain levels and not at all. Why? One of the problems which Foucault is dealing with when he's thinking about governmentality is he's thinking about the self-regulation of individuals. When you're posing the question of fragmented sovereignties the way I'm posing it, you are looking not at individual conduct or the conduct of conduct, as Foucault would say, but you are looking at the conduct of government. But you're looking at the conduct of government, so governmentality, however, you will have actors who are not just the nation state. So I'm interested in multinational corporations, I'm interested in civil society actors and actors of law, and also not just those who are protesting. A lot of the kind of things that I've been interested in, civil society actors are also norm-setting actors. So they are making alternative suggestions as to how you could have a regime of intellectual property which would be closer to the interests of the communities who have developed certain kinds of local knowledge in the kinds of agricultural commodities, etc., etc. So there are also other alternatives coming from people's movements. And yet, this is not the level at which, so you can use the governmentality framework to look at non-state actors, who are also actors of governance. But what you can, I think, makes sense to think in terms of fragmented sovereignties if what you are interested in is self-regulating conduct of individuals. So I think it's very much a question of what the unit of analysis here is, or on what scale are you thinking about certain phenomena. If you're thinking in terms of neoliberal governmentality, then I think fragmented sovereignties can give you a handle on some aspects of it again, because neoliberal governmentality focuses on, of course, both the privatization of certain forms of state functions and also on its transnationalization. So yes, you have the state, but the state is no longer the state that we used to have because it's part transnationalized and part privatized. I think Saskia Sassen's work is good here to show the kinds of spheres of state functions which are transnationalized, the spheres which are privatized. So basically for us as anthropologists, this is very good. This is where political scientists go berserk, because they don't like to have the object of their analysis, the state, deconstructed in such a way. For us as anthropologists, this is very useful because we are able to look at state practices in very many micro settings and can show exactly that there will not be necessarily one particular logic to state action. And therefore we can take it apart in its specific local context and show also how different logics can clash. You can have the judiciary and the administration or the legislature, which is basically getting totally marginalized. So this is one of my other preoccupations, which I haven't talked about today. But just think of the kinds of processes I'm describing to you. These are processes which are leading to a large amount of depoliticization and de-democratization. Because what you are getting is laws or norms which are formally legitimate, like the WTO, but they are socially not legitimate. So there is more and more of a divergence between formal and social legitimacy. So therefore what you're getting is a totally disinterest, because what you're getting also, as I said, the line between law and policy is getting blurred. What does this mean? If a law is passed by Parliament, you have public deliberation on that law. But if you have a policy made by your finance ministry or your trade ministry together with the World Bank or the IMF as part of a credit conditionality, then it never goes to Parliament. So you cannot have any public debate and public deliberation on this. And this removes it. So the World Bank even has a nice term for it. It says locking in of good policy. So locking in of good policy for the World Bank means you are taking it out of the realm of politics and of political decision making, and they think this is very good because this means that with every change in government you can't change policy. But which basically means that we as citizens have ever less influence on policy making because it's made by the administration and not by Parliament. So I think if you are looking at where has the power gone, the power has not just evaporated, or it hasn't only gone to the supranational institutions. Within the nation state, the power has shifted from the legislature to the administration. And a lot of it, because it has shifted to the administration, has led to a judicialization of politics because citizens can only use courts to hold the administration accountable. Because Parliament is no longer the space in which you can have a certain kind of public debate. So I think these are the kinds of issues which I think, yes, we can think about them in terms of neoliberal governmentality, because these are issues of neoliberal governmentality. But Foucault is not thinking about them because he's thinking about other things using that notion. Last point on legal pluralism and economic law and personal status law. This is a large story in which religious laws play a very big role. The kinds of legal pluralism here are probably the ones which are, I would venture to guess and say they are global, they are universal in the sense, in every country where you have some kind of legal pluralism, you will have that pluralism in personal status. And this is because in some countries, like in India, where the constitution itself recognizes the differences in personal status laws, and in other countries it's not explicit. So Germany, for example, is a country in which you have the problem, how will you get a divorce between two Turkish people married according to Turkish law, but divorcing in Germany. So it cannot be according to German law in a German court. So you set up special courts to be able to do this, and you have to train German judges to be able to administer Turkish law. But, and this becomes a little bit of an issue of debate, because you don't want to go the Canadian way, you do not want to have, or British way where you do not want to have Sharia courts being introduced into your multicultural complex. But you have to find some measure of plurality here. But what you also forget is that the Jewish community in Germany, even today, it exercises control over personal status laws. So all family law decisions will take place within the community. And as I don't know if you've been following these scandals in the German Catholic Church, the bishops who have been spending too much money in renovating their houses in luxurious fashions, etc., etc. The problem is church law operates. You cannot take that bishop to court, because he has to be, the norms which apply to his case are church law and to be applied by the church. So there is a lot of legal plurality, even in a highly homogenized and centralized system like Germany, which would see itself as a non-plural system. But I think if you look very carefully ethnograpically, even there you will find a great deal of plurality, and especially in the personal status laws. So one could look at them in very many different ways. Look at the arena of justice. You can even look at the norms and the plurality of sources of norms. You can look at people's understandings of and perceptions of that plurality. And what is striking to me is, because I come from a country in which that plurality is explicitly recognized, explicitly acknowledged, and people always, when we say this, they say, oh, this is a Lebanon-like situation. For them, this is a catastrophe, that you have all of this plurality. And I mean, I'm not going to say this plurality is an unalloyed blessing, because, of course, in India, the debate has been a very complicated one. On the one hand, the women's movement was asking for having homogeneous law, because they wanted to have uniform women's rights protected by a uniform set of laws. But this is the demand now of the Hindu nationalists. They want a uniform set of laws, and that uniform set of laws should be Hindu, because this is the majority in the country, and therefore its norms should become the national norms. And the minute this cooptation, usurpation of this demand happened, the women's movement dropped its demand for a uniform law and said, let's try and reform each status law for its own community through efforts from within. And so there are a lot of progressive women's groups in Lucknow, for example, which you know, which there are 4 different Muslim women's groups in Lucknow who have come up with alternatives to Islamic law from a feminist point of view. And what would a Nikanama look like, which comes from these different groups, and those alternatives are the ones on the table. So you have a lot of alternatives coming from below, from within the state, suggesting how you could reform differently from something centralized and from above. Yes, please. Just a glass. But if it's easy, it is.
about, on one hand, there are lots of mechanisms to control birds and so on that the states have, but on the other hand, they show failure to register birds, so bird registration. I mean, I'm connecting this to my own research, dealing with legal and visible Roma from post-Muslim region. And my question that I always wonder about is that so lack of birth registration by the state, is that due to lack of agency by the state, or is this due to the agency of the state that doesn't want to register? In general, I mean, they don't want to register a change of population, so it's somehow, I don't know, I'm just pondering on this, like, how would you conceptualize this in general?
So this is an interesting question because how should I say? It's difficult to know in abstract. I think you can only in a particular context make an argument for why certain things are done or not done, or claim that they cannot be done. So I don't know if the state is claiming here that it is unable to do it, or it considers it unnecessary to do so. Why it would be advantageous not to register certain populations or to classify them in a particular way. And of course, it could be very much a question of, like, for example, the government of India will not classify the populations I'm talking about as indigenous. So it continues to call them Adivasi, which is the one or the first settlers, or it continues to call them as scheduled tribes, as the British call them, but not indigenous. Because if they were classified as indigenous, then of course they could claim indigenous people's rights according to international law. So classification has a lot of legal implications and also international law implications. So, so it's very much about registration, numerical claims which can always be made in the name of numbers and of certain kinds of classification. So the larger point I think here that I can make maybe some thinking about something is an Indian scientist, who makes a very, very good argument, I think. And his argument is that actually that doesn't matter. No, so he makes a very interesting argument in what he calls the transformation. So now not looking at the state, but looking at the identities of the groups which are either registered or not registered, classified or not. And he makes an interesting argument which may have some mileage for some of you here. So that's why he says once you classify and enumerate, you number, you count, you get a shift from what he calls fuzzy identities to enumerated identities. And he says pre-modern identities in the whole world were always fuzzy identities. They were fuzzy identities because they were plural identities. You could have several identities at the same time. So the 1921 Indian census by the British is a very interesting one because 800,000 Indians registered themselves as Mohammedan Hindus. The set description of them is, we are Mohammedan Hindus. So they refuse this binary logic of classification, are you Hindu, are you Muslim, they're both. And by the same logic, but fuzzy identities, once you start counting, they get, once they're enumerated, they get very fixed contours. So the same problem with Rwanda, you have that in mind as a good example, that you see you could be a Hutu and a Tutsi, or you could have been a Hutu, you could become a Tutsi, depending on your occupation, whether you're a pastoralist or whether you're an agriculturalist, right? Marriage could change ethnic identity from one to the other. So this was not not ethnic identity which was immutable, unchangeable, but this was, so these identities were very fuzzy, they could be plural, the boundaries of the community were therefore not fixed, because you never counted them. And because you didn't count them, the numbers didn't mean anything. Yeah, how many of X are there was not an argument to make a political claim for anything. It's once you get into the logic of enumeration, you get the logic of minorities. Who is a minority? And once you can make claims in the names of majority and minority, you are getting into a very different political arithmetic logic. And this is one of the downsides of democracy. And then, of course, you have the Hindu nationalists in my country at the moment who claim for themselves a permanent majority. Right? They are always in a majority. So it's not like in a democracy you will have issue-based majorities which are shifting majorities. On this issue you may have a majority, and on another one you may lose your majority. But if your majority is based on either your ethnicity or on your religion, and these are no longer fuzzy identities of ethnicity or religion because you can't change, you're either a Hindu or a Muslim, then you have permanent majorities. And then if you have a permanent majority of certain kind of political decision making in the name of those majorities, you are in a totally different political game. And I think that is why it is worthwhile to think about what happens to also self-identities of people, collective self-identities, in the process of enumerating them. And then we come to Foucault and biopolitics and governmentality in a very large sense, because this is the modern state. And in order to provide a certain kind of welfare, but also conscription for the army, it needs to enumerate and count. Once it starts counting, it sets a machinery in motion which has a lot of unintended effects, some of which we are seeing now. And in the post-colonial world, so in the former colonies, of course, the boundaries of language, of caste, of ethnicity, etc., are all extremely fuzzy boundaries until they get enumerated. So it's when the German missionaries start writing the grammars of a lot of these African languages that the languages get these fixed, bounded communities of language. So it's that codification in terms of grammar, in terms of classification, in terms of political territory, in terms of, and then with that comes the whole language of rights, which gets associated with that. So it's not an unalloyed blessing. This,
Okay, just a comment, maybe not a question. I agree with you that maybe imperialism is a phenomenon that we should look upon to study new phenomena. And I think maybe what you said in the social study that it's not so common. But I like your lecture, and I think it's a little bit ambivalent in a certain way that I like. You are arguing for plurality all the time, as I understood. But your critical analysis are leaning upon some basic concepts. And you said about depolitization of the whole process, public deliberation. You used a lack of public deliberation, administration of politics, jurisdiction of politics. So for me these concepts are very interesting because they are critical. And they are leaning upon theory that is of course 19th century theory.
Very interesting.
Yes. Yes. So for me maybe the record would be on this side because it's a side of the judgment of whole situation, and it's hard to judge, and it's maybe easy to argue for plurality because everybody argues these days. So that's my comment.
yes, but if I may go into that, so I'm not argument for plurality.
Okay, maybe that
I
was
think
my impression.
Yeah, no, I think plurality is a good thing,
Mhm.
but I'm not making an argument for plurality. I am making an argument in terms of democratic theory, which I think is a ambivalent argument, as you very rightly point out. What I didn't do today, but I have done elsewhere, so if you want to look up, I don't know if you're an anthropologist, but you are. So then the new issue of, a special issue of current anthropology, which just came out last week. If you take a look, it's Veena Das and we've edited, Veena Das and I, we are editors of this issue. It is called Politics of the Urban Poor, on the issue. And what we are doing there is looking at what is the politics of the urban poor, and it's basically, so we are not questioning so much the urban, we are taking it as a given, except that we are making the argument that the city itself, the city form and the city, a specific city itself has a lot of agency in forming this politics. But what we are questioning are the terms politics and poor. So we are making the argument that it's very empirically, it's very difficult to basically pin down who is the poor, and to try and think through the context to see what poverty in this particular context means, etc. But we are making a strong argument on what is politics and the need to think politics differently. So yes, you got me on the wrong foot by saying this is 19th century political deliberation. And I will confess to being a liberal on this, very much so. But what we are doing there ethnographically is trying to show that it's very difficult to have a predefined sphere of the political or of politics, because a lot of what could just be labeled as mere strategies of survival are, if you are very, very poor, they are your politics. And that politics is no longer in the trade union, but it can be in your neighborhood. And it can be networks which are no longer in the 19th century associational networks of civil society, where we would be thinking of looking for the institutional forms of that politics. And that politics may not be about intervening in parliamentary deliberative decision making. It cannot be reduced to electoral politics, but much of it is about just getting the means, the electricity, the water, the road, a toilet, or school admission for your children if you are a poor migrant in Ankara or in Delhi or in China, you are an unregistered migrant, or in Indonesia or in Egypt. So again, we are looking exactly ethnographically at what could, how capacious a definition or what kinds of practices of daily life would politics encompass in a situation when it is focused on the poor. So I very much take your point there. My own latest work is very much about rethinking this notion of where the political is, who are the agents of politics, and what is a political practice. And when do we recognize it? What do we need to do in order to recognize it as such, as outside observers and analysts? Going back to Partha Chatterjee, going even much more beyond the political society. Therefore, this can be, so we are looking at, I mean, in that volume, people are looking at Lebanese refugee camps, people are looking at urban politics of mobility in Jakarta, people are looking at housing rights. And one of the kinds of questions that we raise in that volume is, why are some domains of life so much more politicized in certain contexts than others? Because it's not a question which anthropologists usually ask themselves, right? And this may be worth thinking about, because what we are finding is, for example, housing rights are everywhere highly politicized. Health rights are not. People are not mobilizing for their right to health, which is as crucial as their right to dwell somewhere. But the mobilization around housing rights, not that I have an answer, but I think if you're asking some new questions about the nature of politicization, we may get some new answers. So I think it's about shifting some questions here as well.
Then I think we'll leave you in peace now. Thank you very much. I would just like to thank, first of all, Professor, for being with us, but I would also like to thank all of you for coming. It's a wonderful, our visitors, our guests from Zagreb as well. Thank you. It's a great treat for us to have so many anthropologists in the building together at the same time. It was a big treat, so thank you very much for coming as well. And thank you very much for your questions, and mainly thank you to you for your very stimulating talk and answers to your questions. So thank you very much.
I would like to say a special word of thanks to Dr. Erad Hosek, because it's thanks to him that I'm here. He's driven me all the way from here. So I owe very special thanks for introducing me to the Institute in Reka and for bringing me.